You all survived. You came back. So must not have scared you off week 1 too much, right? Ezekiel's, like I said, it's an interesting book, and we're spending a lot of time here in the first chapter, but just want to kind of get some things established. So we're going to do a little bit of a recap. So who was not here last week? Jason, Bob, we got a few. Okay, who was here last week? Oh, now I know who was lying and didn't answer. No, I'm just kidding. So we're going to do a quick recap for those of you who weren't here and those of you who were, because we went through a lot of stuff, if you remember last week. We had a lot of things we covered. So we talked about the world in which Ezekiel lived. Do you remember what it was like? Babylonians had basically started to take over, but the temple was still standing. Jerusalem is still standing. So Ezekiel is, typically thought of as, he's this guy who was there after everything was destroyed, but that's not true. He was taken in what I would call like the second wave. They had these 3 ones.
Before or during the Babylonian captivity?
This is during. Yeah. So it had started, and then they took Ezekiel out, we'll say, towards the beginning of that, but they had not defeated and destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. And so he's there in Babylon, not in the city. He's in a little place by Nippur, which is outside of town, kind of. And that's where he's at, okay? So the world in which he lived right now is one where they are being judged, okay? The Israelites are essentially under judgment. He has watched them come in and take over the area, and he knows that Israel is still there. There's still people there. Jerusalem is still standing. The temple is still there. But here he is in a foreign nation. And that was a problem for a lot of the Jews because they're going, why am I here? If Yahweh is our God and he promised our ancestors, why are we here? They didn't quite make the connection. Obviously, Ezekiel was a prophet that we looked at last week. Was he kind of an interesting guy? Very different duck. If you look at him from a psychology standpoint, he was married. We talked about that. We're going to talk more about how his wife dies and some of the things that happen with that later on. We looked a little bit about the call. We kind of started with this. God kind of calls him in a pretty amazing way with this vision in the clouds and right here in chapter 1. And that led us into talking about the storm theophany. Do you remember what that is? What's the storm theophany?
God lives in the cloud.
He manifests, shows up in this storm or this cloud imagery. So it shows up in a lot of places. Where else do we see a storm theophany? God showing up in like a storm.
Came from
Sinai, that's it. And coming out of Egypt. We're going to look at some of that today. But this idea that there's this lightning and thunder and clouds and earthquakes, and they call it the storm theophany. God appearing in like a storm type of a thing. Now, we talked a little bit about that last week. Why is that important from a New Testament standpoint? What did Jesus tell the high priest right before they crucified him? Next time you see me, I'll be coming on the clouds, which immediately connected him back to Daniel, which was a storm theophany that he has this vision of, the cloud rider, the one riding on the clouds. And when Jesus says, that's me, they go, whoa, you're making yourself equal to Yahweh, to God. So the storm theophany, we talked about that. And then we spent kind of the end, and a lot of the time, talking about these living creatures. They were a little bit weird, weren't they? Got some weird creatures showing up. What were some of the things that jumped out at you? 4 faces. What else? Wings. Got weird faces on them. Eyes. All kinds of strange stuff. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit more about those today. Spend a little more time talking about those creatures. Try to wrap that piece up. Okay. Let's go back to Ezekiel chapter 1. Okay. We're going to look at verses 4 through 7 real quick. It says, and I looked, and look, a storm wind was coming from the north, a great cloud, and a fire flashing back and forth, and brightness around and within it. And from its midst it was like the outward appearance of amber stone from the midst of the fire. And from its midst was the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance, a human form. Each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. And their legs were straight legs, and the sole of their feet was like the sole of the foot of a calf, and they were sparkling like the outward appearance of polished bronze. So this is the very beginning of what Ezekiel sees, right? When he's getting this vision. It goes on to say, and under their wings were human hands on their 4 sides, and their faces and their wings for the 4 of them were as follows. The wings were touching one another. Each of them went straight forward without turning right or left. The likeness of their faces was the face of a human in front, and the face of a lion on the right of each of them, the face of an ox on the left of each of them, the face of an eagle for each of them. All these weird pictures, right? Weird imagery. A little bit further. So were their faces. Their wings were spread out upward, and each had 2 touching one another and 2 covering their bodies, and each went straight forward. Wherever the Spirit went, they went, and they did not turn as they went. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches. It was moving to and fro between the living creatures, and the fire was very bright, and lightning was going out from the fire. And the living creatures were speeding to and fro like the appearance of lightning. Would this get your attention if you were, you'd be like, what in the world is this? There's a lot of internet, we'll say, people that will immediately make this into its UFOs. I think there's even probably some Christians that think, well, this is, UFO. Ezekiel saw a UFO. No, he did not see a UFO. Okay.
I had a pastor that used this passage for saying for animals went to heaven.
Really? Yeah, I don't know how you would get that from this one.
I even had a friend look at it, and we're both going,
Yeah.
huh?
Animals getting to heaven would not be what Ezekiel is, being messaged. So, I don't know that I would get that one. Interesting. Yeah, I haven't heard that one before. So you have this strange imagery that he's seeing. We're going to look at some more of that, but I want to talk about these creatures because this is not, I know this is going to sound weird, this is not something that would have been unknown to the ancient world. That's why it's definitely not a UFO. Okay? If you do some history and you start looking at some iconography of Babylonian, Assyrian, Egyptian, you're going to find pretty quickly this is not unknown. Ezekiel had an idea of what he was seeing, and others would have seen this. They would have had an idea of what they were seeing too, and I want to kind of walk you through some of that today. Not a UFO, okay? Not an unknown thing. There's messaging here that's really important, okay? So some of the characteristics that I want you to just keep in mind. Each character had 4 wings. We read that, right? Under their wings were human hands. And now, I always read this as it must have been like covered with human hands. It could have been that they had 4 wings and they just had a pair of hands like we do, like they were just like a human kind of form, okay?
Do you have any pictures?
I didn't, because there's so many different ones that have, I want you to just use your imagination, okay? Because I looked at many artist renderings of what this would look like, and literally they're all over the board. And so you kind of envision, I think your mind might do better than the artist would, because you're picturing this being with like the 4 faces around. That's probably what I would stick with. So I did not do that on purpose. Yeah. Now, they don't change direction when they move. So they're kind of like always moving, so they're always facing forward. They don't have to turn. Is that kind of weird? Their appearance is connected to the likeness of burning coals, fire, and lightning. It doesn't mean they are, okay? When the Bible says they're like something, don't immediately mean that's what it is, okay? So there's a lot of language in Ezekiel that says it was like, or it appeared like. That doesn't mean it was, okay? He's doing his best to try to relay what it is he's seeing. And so they're clearly bright, I would say. There's this bronze kind of glow, you could say, coming from this cloud and from the creatures. We'll talk more about that here in the future. Let's look at these wings really quick. Here's a few verses. Under their wings were human hands on their 4 sides. Wings were touching one another. Their wings were spread out upward. Each had 2 touching one another and 2 covering their bodies. So can you kind of get that image in your head? They kind of have these 2 that are outstretched. There's 2 covering themselves. It's kind of an interesting thing. Okay? Have we ever seen this before? Is this a new thing that Ezekiel? Yeah. On the ark, right? Now, is the ark before this or after this? Before, right? Yeah, before. Because you have the Exodus and all that kind of stuff, and that's where they get the instructions to build it. And so Moses gets these skillful craftsmen, and what do? They build the ark, tabernacle. Remember, you're in the temple now. Solomon has come. There's a temple there, and they've built it, and that's what's happening in Jerusalem at the time Ezekiel's getting this vision. There is a temple of Solomon standing there, and what's typically in the temple? The ark. The ark. Now, you could get into Raiders of the Lost Ark. What happened to it? Where did it go? One of the ideas is that during the siege, that's when it was either destroyed. I think it was probably destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, but no indication that he necessarily took it. But it may have been sitting in the temple of Solomon at the time Nebuchadnezzar came in, and when he destroyed Jerusalem, that final wave or final attack, it's gone. Temple's destroyed, Ark's destroyed, Jerusalem's destroyed. No more Ark of the Covenant. Okay, but Ezekiel's a kid. Remember, his dad was a priest, right? In fact, what was his dad's name? Do you guys remember? Boozy. You know how many times I heard Boozy this week from my boys? Because they were in class, they were sitting in here, they were joking about Boozy all week. Anyway, he grew up in the temple. Ezekiel did, right? And so do you think he had seen the ark? Probably. He was familiar with what the ark looked like. He's familiar with the Temple of Solomon looked like. Okay, so let's talk about the ark for a second. Exodus 15. And they will make an ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits its length, and 1.5 cubits its width, and 1.5 cubits its height. And you will overlay it with pure gold. Inside and outside you will overlay it, and you will make it a gold molding all around. Then he goes on to say, and you will make an atonement cover of pure gold, 2.5 cubits its length, and 1.5 cubits its width. And you will make 2 cherubim of gold. Okay, what is that? Cherubim, there they are, okay? You will make them of hammered work at the 2 ends of the atonement cover, and make 1 cherub at one end and 1 cherub at the other end of the atonement cover. You will make the cherub on its 2 ends, and the cherub will with what? Outspread wings above, covering with their wings over the atonement cover, and facing each other. The faces of the cherubim will be toward the atonement cover. Okay, do you get this in your mind? The ends of this, if you've seen, who's seen Raiders of the Lost Ark? They did a pretty good job of showing, the cherubim on the ends with the wings kind of outstretched facing the center of it. That's kind of similar to what Ezekiel's seeing, isn't it, a little bit? Some similarities with these cherubim with the wings outstretched. Here's a verse in 2 Kings. So Hezekiah is, being attacked by the Assyrians. It says, then Hezekiah prayed before the face of Yahweh and said, O Yahweh, God of Israel, who lives above the cherubim. You are God, you alone of all the kingdoms of the world. You have made the heavens and the earth. So Hezekiah, this is before Ezekiel's day, calls God what? The God who lives above the cherubim. Now, what in the world does that mean? Okay. Think about Ezekiel's vision. We're kind of fast forwarding a little bit, but we've been talking about these creatures. What's coming? Where are these creatures in relation to the one he sees sitting on the throne? They're below it. And then he's going to have this kind of sea of glass or this crystal thing that he sees, and then there's a throne on top of it. So there's this concept even in Hezekiah's day of what is God, how does it look? How does this appearance of God look? Where does he sit? What's his throne room look like? What does his throne look like? And here you have Hezekiah saying, well, I know he's above the cherubim. Now, could that be reference also to the ark and in the temple? Where did God appear to talk to Moses? Above the ark. A lot of people think, it was on the ark. The ark's actually called his footstool. David calls it his footstool. So the idea is you got this ark where they would put the tablets, and then you have God up above it. Okay? And that's imagery that is proper when it comes to how God has, shown how he wants to be seen. Is he equal with the cherubim? No, he's above. Okay, he alone sits on the throne. Okay. Now, why else is this side note? Why else is it important with the Ark of the Covenant as his footstool? What did they do in the ancient world with their contracts, especially in Egypt? The Pharaoh would put it under the throne in a box to say the covenant is always before me. The contract is always present. And so here you have God say, make me an ark, calls it his footstool, and then what they put in it? The contract. They would have understood this because of where they came from. They were coming right out of Egypt. They knew exactly what this meant. Okay? The wheels are kind of weird on this thing. Verses 15 and 16 of Ezekiel 1 says, I saw the living creatures, and look, a wheel was on the earth beside each of the living creatures that had 4 faces. The appearance of the wheels and their construction was like the appearance of beryl. And they all looked alike, and their appearance and their construction was like a wheel within a wheel. This is where people say, okay, UFOs, no question. Okay? It's a wheel. Okay? It's just a wheel. It goes on to say, and when they moved, they went toward their 4 sides. They did not veer at all as they went. Their rims were high and awesome. Yeah, that's like I read this earlier this week. I'm like, this would fit really well in some of our culture today because you got the guys driving and they got the tricked out trucks or whatever. And I'm like, is this like God was the first one to have the really sweet ride? I don't know. Could be. Apparently Ezekiel saw and he said the rims were full of eyes all around, but he also calls them high and awesome. So apparently the rims caught his attention. And at that going of the living creatures, the wheels next to them also went, and when the creatures were lifted from the ground, the wheels also rose. So the best way to kind of visualize this is you have these cherubim and kind of down either by their legs or somewhere low, there's a wheel by them. So you kind of imagine like a cart with like a leg that's like a cherubim, okay? Wheeled cart with legs that are cherubim. Kind of weird imagery, okay? It's a wheel within a wheel. Now, how would you picture this? I was envisioning a wheel, and then you had like another wheel, like a smaller wheel inside. So it was like a normal wheel with just like an inside rim kind of a thing, But that's actually probably not it. It was probably a wheel, and then it had another wheel that went this way. So it was kind of like, think of a gyroscope. And then you could move any direction. That's kind of the idea, is it could go any direction without necessarily having to turn. Make sense?
You remember spinners
Yeah.
on wheels? Like, that was
Yeah.
a fancy thing. Like, it looked like it was moving.
Yeah, people's rims and the spinner on the inside. Yeah. Maybe that's what God had. I don't know. Gyroscope look is kind of the thing that jumped out at me, was this idea of the kind of the wheel within a wheel. Go any direction without turning. Covered in eyes. It's kind of weird. Here's Ezekiel 1:16. The appearance of the wheels and their construction was like the appearance of beryl. The rims were high and awesome, and all four of the rims were full of eyes all around. Okay. Now, Ezekiel uses a phrase when he's talking about this, suggesting the eyes. He uses, I'm not going to get into the Hebrew grammar, but he uses a specific notation that might suggest that he's referring to an eye-like gemstone that they had in the ancient Babylonian world. It was a precious gem that they would use on chariot wheel hubs. Like all the little rivets, what we would see like a rivet, they were precious stones. And so when he says eyes, could it be literal eyes? Possible. But it's also possible that he's referring to an eye-like gemstone that he's seeing on the rivets of this particular wheel. Okay, so just keep that in mind. It may not be literal eyes, but it could be.
What's the beryl or whatever?
Beryl. It's like I want to say, if I remember right, it's kind of like it's a gemstone, but it's almost like a amber color, I think. Am I wrong on that?
Okay.
Is it a brownish color? Okay. Yeah. Precious stones, they would have recognized beryl. They had a lot of that stuff back then. You're going to see a lot of the stones listed, gems. There's one specifically that's coming up that was, like the most sought after one in the ancient world, and that happens to be what God's throne is made of, ironically. Okay. You have to keep in mind that when God appears to Ezekiel, he didn't do it with the 21st century in mind. He didn't appear to him in the manner that what we would see and be like, wow, that's a precious stone. Diamonds. I always wonder, how come there's no diamonds? Well, you wonder, why is it? Well, you have to think of their worldview. And when God says, I'm going to make an appearance, he does it with the ancient Canaanite, Mesopotamian, Babylonian culture in mind so that everyone that's there will know exactly what he's trying to relay. And that sounds really weird. But he didn't have to jump to the 21st century like we would and say, oh, it's got to be all this modern stuff that Ezekiel can't see. He can appear however he wants to get the point across. And he did. He got the point across. Right? Common wheel decorations. Okay, ancient context. Let's talk about this. So in ancient Babylon, you had a lot of imagery of a deity, and guess what they were being pulled by? Cherubim. Okay? These beings that were like half animal with wings, and they would have some human features, and they were drawing these chariots. That was kind of the way they relayed the deity. The deity was sitting on this cart, and it was being pulled by these divine beings. Does that not sound like what Ezekiel is seeing? It sounds terrifying, I would agree. But this was the idea of saying they're otherworldly, not like us, right? And interestingly, the deity would have these beings pull, But in this illustration, what's causing these things to move? We're going to answer that in a minute. But it's not that the cherubim are pulling the deity like they have control over where it goes. In Ezekiel's vision, they are directed by the Spirit that tells them where to go. It's interesting. In the Babylonian imagery, you see a lot of these beings. They actually included oxen. They had oxen faces, eagle faces, human faces, lion faces. Isn't that what we just read in Ezekiel? That's because those were the animals that represented different things. And here you have God's cherubim, and they have all of them. It's not one or the other, it's all of them. Okay? Cherubim actually comes from an Akkadian word, kiribu. Okay, that's the root of the word cherubim. Okay, it literally means guardian or throne guardian. So Ezekiel didn't come up with the term cherubim. Okay, it's actually a term that's been around a while, but it was understood to be a divine being, not necessarily a god, but like an angelic being that's job was to protect and guard the throne of the deity. Okay, so when he says, oh, cherubim, he actually doesn't say that in chapter 1 of Ezekiel. I don't know if you noticed that. He has not said the word cherubim yet. Where do we get cherubim from and put it into this particular vision? It doesn't come till Ezekiel 10. He has another vision, almost describes the same stuff, and then he goes, oh, by the way, it's cherubim. I know what it is now. There's actually a similar being that was known in ancient Egypt. Okay, have you ever heard of a seraphim? Okay, it's more of an Egyptian tone because seraph was a term they used for a snake. Okay, it can mean something else, but it typically is understood to be snake. And what did they do in ancient Egypt? They protected the deity or sacred objects, and that's what they would do. They would spit fire, was their understanding, if you got too close. So here you have these cherubim, and what are they doing? Protecting. They're like the throne guardians. And you notice all the language, it talks about the burning fire, and it's like all this burning fire language about their appearance. Is there a connection? Could be. Okay. Interestingly, in Egypt, they were based on this thing called the Rhesus serpent, which actually looked like a cobra. And so if you can picture a cobra, what's a unique factor about a cobra that's different than other snakes? The hood. The hood. And you know what they would call that? Wings. So you have a winged serpent, and they called it a seraph. Okay? And so you have to think of that on the idea that where is, the Israelites coming from? They spent 400 years in Egyptian captivity, or in Egyptian bondage, I guess you could say. And they learned a lot of Egyptian stuff. Would you agree? Did God just say, I want you to just throw all that out, I'm not going to use any of that? No, he uses that stuff to get across what he wants. Okay? Uses that. You've probably seen this. What's this? This is the mask of King Tut. Okay? You notice kind of the winged look on it? And you notice the snakes up here? Seraph. What's it doing? It's protecting the divine, because the Pharaoh was a divine being. Okay? So this is part of the culture in which the Israelites came out of when they were in Egypt. So I'm showing you all this to show you this is not like new stuff. What he's seeing in some of this imagery is stuff that's been around, and it has connections from the past. Okay? In fact, here's what Isaiah 6 says. Remember the call of Isaiah? In the 6th year of the death of Uzziah the king, I saw the Lord sitting on a high and raised throne, and the hem of his robe was filled the temple. Seraphs, there they are, were standing above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. So he's getting a similar thing to Ezekiel. I'm being invited by God to see him on his throne. And now you don't have cherubim necessarily described. You have seraphim described. Is he seeing a similar thing? Are these different beings? Now we typically say, well, seraph is a different word than cherub. So we must have 2 different classifications of beings here. But they're
standing above.
They are. They are.
The others were below.
Below, right. And so the idea here is they both have similar things they do, though. What does a seraph do that a cherub does? Throne guardians. They're there to guard the throne. They are there attending and making sure you don't come in if you're not supposed to come in. In fact, what happens with Isaiah? He says, woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips. And then what happens? One of the seraph touches his lips with a coal, and it basically makes him okay to be in that space. Okay? So this is not uncommon imagery from the ancient world. Having a being protect the throne of a deity is not unusual in the ancient world. Okay? Seraph can mean snake, or it can also mean to burn, hence the spitting of fire. Okay? So some would say it's not actually a snake-like figure, it's just one that could burn things, burn people. Okay? Depending on how they interpret it. Here's the bottom line. Ezekiel is seeing what was known in the ancient world to be a divine throne chariot. This is not new imagery. This is something they were familiar with. It was what the Babylonians presented with their deities. You had cherubim pulling a deity on a throne chariot as they took them wherever they needed to go, as they moved around. And so how does God show up? On a throne chariot, pulled by cherubim. It's not really even being pulled. It's just they're there. They're underneath. Okay? So anybody tells you it's a UFO, no, it's not a UFO. Okay? This is ancient world iconography. You can find ancient world imagery that's seen in many different places. Okay? Not new. It's protected and drawn by cherubim. Ezekiel actually figures that out in chapter 10, and he replaces the face of the ox with the face of a cherub. He changes what he sees in chapter 10. He says, oh yeah, by the way, I think I know what that is now. It's a cherubim. Here's actually Ezekiel 10. And there appeared for the cherubim the form of a human hand under their wings, and I saw and looked 4 wheels beside the cherubim, 1 wheel beside each cherub, and the appearance of the wheels was like the outward appearance of turquoise stone. Their appearance was the same for each of the 4 of them, as if the wheel was in the midst of a wheel. When they went to the 4 of the directions that they went, they did not change direction when they went for the place to which the head turned. They went behind him. They did not change direction at their going. Then he says, and their whole body and their rims and their spokes and their wings and the wheels were full of eyes all around, the wheels for the 4 of them. Concerning the wheels, he was calling them the wheelwork in my hearing. Okay? And each one had 4 faces. The faces of the one was the face of a cherub. So that used to be the face of an ox. But now in chapter 10, when he gets the next vision, he's going, no, it's not an ox. It's a cherub. This is where we see the term cherub show up. Okay? And the face of the second was a human. The face of the third was a lion. The 4th was an eagle. So the only one that's swapped out is the ox for a cherub. Okay? Then he says this, and the cherubim, there he calls them again, rose, that is the living creatures that I saw at the Kibar River. So now he says, I remember back to chapter 1 when I got my first vision, or in chapter 10 really quick, and he says, I know what it was. These are the same creatures I saw when I was there by the river, the Kibar Canal, right? And it says, when the cherub went, the wheels beside them went, and when the cherub lifted their wings to rise up from the earth, the wheels also did not turn aside from beside them. When they stood, and at their rising, they rose with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in them. So there's like this spirit connection between the wheels and the creatures. Kind of weird. And then look at this. This was the living creature that I saw under the God of Israel at the Kibar River, and I knew that they were cherubim. So he even goes as far as to say, I think I've nailed this one down. I think I know what I saw. I know it. It was a cherubim. He doesn't get to that until chapter 10. Chapter 1, he's just going, what is this? What am I seeing? And he's doing his best to describe it. But he hasn't made the total okay, I've thought about this. I saw this again. Cherubim. I saw cherubim pulling the throne. Okay.
How long between the visions?
There's debate on that, but I think if I remember right, he got all of his visions, and again, I'll have to look for sure, but I want to say it was a number of years. I can't remember exactly how many years. I want to say less than 10, I believe, but I don't remember exactly, so I don't want to tell you wrong. It wasn't like he got one and the next day he got another one. There was time passed in between, but I'll find that out for you because I don't remember exactly. Now here's something unique. What made these creatures and the wheels move? This is different than the other throne chariots of the ancient world, because what pulled them? The cherubim. If the cherubim wanted to go, it was like horses. Here we go, Ezekiel 1:20 says, wherever the Spirit went, they would go there. And the wheels rose, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. And so the question is when he says the first, whatever the spirit went, what spirit is this? Yeah. Some would say, well, this was the spirit of the living creatures, so it's no different than them having. No. It's a different, kind of the way it's worded could be suggested that the spirit determined where they went, and because of determining where they went, the wheels shared into that. So who's driving the movement of this chariot throne? The Spirit. Okay, well, that would suggest that God drives the throne. Okay, and I think
Jesus takes the wheel.
Jesus, take the wheel. That's it. I like it. 100%. It's exactly right. Why is that unique? What is the messaging of that when it comes to how God's throne is moved and driven? What's the messaging? He's in control of where he goes. There's no cherubim, there's no being, there's nothing lesser that drives his chariot. He decides where he's going. And that's significant. It's all-powerful language. I am the all-powerful one. I have everything beneath me, okay? And I decide where I go and where I don't go. A lot of times, you think of the ancient world, if they wanted to get into Egypt, for example, you get up in the morning, you're a priest of Isis or Isis, okay? What do you have to do? You got to go wake the deity up. No joke. They feed them, bring them out, set them in their temple so that people could come and do this thing, and then at night you'd have to put them to bed and all this stuff. That's the world that they're living in. Is this kind of how you interact with the deity? The deity kind of comes to me, and I kind of have to make sure the deity does these things. And what does God say? No. You have this all backwards. Think of Babel. What was the problem with Babel and the tower? What were they trying to do? Get God on their terms. And God said, no, this is not how it works. I'm in charge. I'm in control. I come to you. You don't come to me. Right? I make the way. Then you can come. But I'm in charge. Don't think that humans can manipulate me. Put me in a box. That's why he was so anti-idolatry, right? Not only because he had worshiping something that wasn't real, because what they were trying to do, put the deity in this thing. And God's saying, I'm not containable. You can't do that. So there's this messaging that is consistent with what God tells the people, which is that you won't put me in a box. You won't tell me where to go. I'm the one in charge. The Spirit made the creatures and the wheels move. Okay, the Spirit that we see there, the word is ruach. Okay, it's also used for wind. Okay, you see it a lot of places. It can mean breeze, like blowing through. You might know this famous verse. Now the earth was formless and empty, and the darkness was over the face of the deep, and the ruach of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. What made the wheels and the creatures move? The ruach. Okay, so again, I immediately read this and go, okay, well, when God created, it was the Spirit of God that was hovering over the face of the waters, and then he says, let there be light, and off goes creation. And here you have the ruach causing these creatures to move. So the Spirit of God is active. It's working. Okay. Now let's talk about the throne a little bit. So verse 22, he says, now the likeness above the heads of the living creatures was an expanse like the outward appearance of awesome ice spread out above the heads upward. It might say crystal in some versions. It'll say like awesome crystal. Okay. But I want you to envision, now you're talking about the throne, like the base of it. Okay, so you've got these creatures with wheels, and then right on top of what they're kind of holding, you have this platform that looks like a piece of ice or crystal. Okay? You might remember this. John has this revelation. He says, and before the throne was something like a sea of glass like crystal. So where's the throne at? It's here, and then what do you have? This glass platform almost. And in the midst of the throne and around the throne were 4 living creatures. That's ironic. And look they're full of eyes in front and back. And the first living creature was similar to a lion. The second living creature was similar to an ox. The third living creature had the face like a man's. And the fourth living creature was similar to an eagle flying. Is that not what we just read in Ezekiel 1? And the 4 living creatures, each of them had 6 wings apiece. Well, that sounds like the seraphim from Isaiah, not the cherubim from Ezekiel. Full of eyes all around and inside, and they do not have rest day or night. And then he goes on to say they're saying, holy, holy, holy all the time. Okay. What does John see? I think he's seeing the same thing Ezekiel saw. This is the way that God would say, let me show you. I'm going to invite you into the throne room for a moment and see what it's really like. And you have these 4 creatures with these weird faces, this sea of glass with a throne sitting on it. Ezekiel saw the same thing. Now it's interesting because when we were talking about this last week, Ezekiel doesn't show up in the Old Testament or in the New Testament hardly at all, does he? Where does he show up? Do you remember? In the book of John. That's it. Or the book of Revelation that John wrote. That's it. Because he's called Gog Magog. And that's the only other time we have Ezekiel necessarily, we can say, oh yeah, we know exactly what John was thinking of. But look at John's revelation at the very beginning. He sees what Ezekiel saw. Very similar. Okay? He goes on in verse 24 back to Ezekiel. This is an interesting one. And I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of many waters, like the voice of Shaddai. And when they moved, there was a sound of tumult like the sound of an army. When they stood still, they lowered their wings. And there was a sound from above the expanse that was above their heads. And when they stood, they lowered their wings. So now you not only have visual stuff, Ezekiel's hearing stuff too. And what does it sound like? A lot of noise. Okay, waters and army marching. And it sounds like when they would lower their wings, maybe the sound stopped. Kind of connects the sound with them lowering their wings or not. Yeah. What do you make of this voice of Shaddai? Is that just him being, voice of God, that's true. That's what it means. Okay. There's more to it than that though, would you believe it? He had some things that he was connecting here by using that phrase. Okay. He says this in verse, so now we're in chapter 10 again, and look what he says. And the sound of the wings of the cherubim was heard as far as the outer courtyard. It was like the voice of God Shaddai when he speaks. He uses that phrase again. Now Shaddai is a short way of saying God Shaddai, or El Shaddai. Okay, El being God. Okay, so in one he kind of uses I won't say more of a slang, not really, but he just shortens it up. The other one he uses the full phrase. Okay, God Shaddai versus Shaddai. Okay, now this is an ancient way that people would refer to God as Shaddai. Okay, it's actually a Ugaritic root that actually uses the term mountain. So in Ugaritic, Shaddai or mountain or one of the mountain. So in other words, he could be saying God of the mountain or the God of the one of the mountain. Okay. Now, some ancient texts actually suggest it was a title for the council of God. They talked about how God would meet with his council on the top of a mountain, and they would use that term El Shaddai, the council of God that meets on the mountain. Okay, that's ancient text that they would refer to it that way. So when he says, I heard the voice of Shaddai or El Shaddai, what is he saying? I heard the God of the mountain. I heard him talk. I heard the sound of what it's like when he meets on the mountaintop. Okay. El, and actually in Ugaritic, El was not Yahweh, which we now know, the chief deity is Yahweh. But in Ugaritic, who is El? He was their chief deity, and he had a council. He had a famous son named Baal. And they would meet on a mountain, and they would decide what they're going to do. And here you have Ezekiel saying, I heard the voice of El Shaddai. And who is it? It's not Ugarit's chief deity. It's not Baal's dad. It's Yahweh of Israel. He's the God of the mountain. See how there's this conflict? There's kind of this contrast that goes on.
Who else uses Shaddai in the Bible?
I don't know that there is any others. I could be wrong.
Never heard it.
No, I think that's it, because it's a reference to God. So I don't think you're going to find it anywhere else. Verse 26, and from above the expanse that was above their heads there was the likeness of a throne, looking like a sapphire, and above the likeness of the throne was a likeness similar to the appearance of a human on it, but above it. Okay, so now he's starting to say, okay, we're going to move up a little. Got this crystal sea, this glass platform, and then above that he sees the likeness of a throne, looking like a sapphire. Okay. Now, sapphire in the ancient world is actually lapis lazuli. Okay. It's a blue stone, highly, highly valuable in the ancient world. And what is God's throne made out of? Lapis lazuli. Okay. Did he have to do that? Could have been. I'm like, why not diamonds? I thought diamonds. See, it all depends on what we think. Some people value a sapphire more than a diamond, and so what does God do? He says, I know exactly what the culture is. I know exactly what the people are going to think. Guess what my throne's made out of? The best of the best.
Don't the stones have meanings also?
They're used in different ways in the ancient world, so they could, but I think it depends. I don't have a whole lot of information on what they all meant in different cultures, but I think you're probably right. They probably used them for different things.
In stained glass, blue, which sapphire is a representation of heaven.
Okay. Well, that makes sense then.
Indeed.
Yeah. So there's probably a heavenly connection to that. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah. I think, again, what I took away from it was the fact that it is absolutely the best for the day. In other words, God's throne spares no expense. Okay? He has it full of whatever the best is. It is made of that. Okay? You notice this. Throne was a likeness similar to the appearance of a human. And if you look in Hebrew, look what it says. Adam is the Hebrew term for human. Makes sense, right? And so what's Ezekiel saying here? I saw one who looks human, and he uses that term Adam. Now, what's the connection?
God made us in his likeness.
Yeah, here it is. And God said, let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness. And he says, I saw him sitting on the throne, this being, and he uses that term, Adam. Like Adam. It's not Adam, but it's like him. Now, I would say this is first, before Adam, right? What he's seeing is existed well before Adam did. And it's interesting when you look at this particular verse from Genesis, because he says, let what? That's not Trinity language. They would not have understood that as Trinity language. Who's he talking to? He's talking to the host. He's talking to the council. The people that are part of his heavenly host. Here's what we're going to do, guys. Let's do it. So when you read that and you think Ezekiel El Shaddai, the God of the mountain, or the council of God on the mountain, they had a concept that God was the superior one, and he had some guys, angels, whatever you want to call them, that helped him, and they went out and did this stuff. And here you see it in Genesis. We're going to make man in our image. God made, God's there. He's eternal, all being, and then he creates the host. Well, what did he use to create them? I mean, you got the cherubim description. Did they have human qualities? Faces, hands, eyes, maybe not wings. That sounds more animal to us, right? Feet, legs. They were there before us, I would suggest, right? Revelation 4, immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was set in heaven, and the one was seated on the throne, and the one seated was similar in appearance to jasper and cornelian stone, and a rainbow was around the throne, similar in appearance to emerald, and around the throne were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders dressed in white clothing, and on their heads were gold crowns. It does not tell you in this verse that the elders were humans. It just says they're elders. Now, we immediately pray that as, they must be people. Like maybe these were the top guys of the tribes of Israel. And it's not what it says. It just defines what they are as elders. Okay. Now, I want you to take that verse and think about what we just read in Genesis about let us. What does he see? What does John see in Revelation? God. And then he has these thrones around him of these, it's like the board, right? And they make decisions together. I don't know why God does it that way, but that seems to be the imagery that's understood in the ancient world and what's illustrated.
But wasn't Jesus and the Holy Spirit there?
I would say yes, they were there, for sure.
It was the council or whatever that God was...
They would be on the throne, in my mind.
Okay.
But we haven't really got into the three pieces because you're still in the Old Testament. They don't know who Jesus is yet.
Okay, yeah.
Now, they had a concept of the Son of Man, which we're going to look at in just a second, but the Holy Spirit, they had a concept that it's not like we understand it. We got all the pieces to put together so we can understand the whole picture. They're still understanding Yahweh, the God above the cherubim who lives in the temple. They understood that. He did take on human form at times, but they didn't quite have the concept that we do in the ancient world. Look at Daniel 7. I continued watching. Now, what's important about Daniel and Ezekiel? Yeah, and they also are both experiencing what?
Babylon.
Exile in Babylon. So they're contemporaries, right? So Daniel's getting visions, Ezekiel's getting visions. So Daniel has this vision, and he says, I continued watching until what? Thrones were placed, and an Ancient of Days, so there's Yahweh, sat. His clothing was like white snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool, and his throne was a flame of fire, and its wheels were burning fire. So he has a throne that's got fire associated with it, and it also has wheels. Does that not sound like what Ezekiel was seeing? You notice he also says the hair of his head. That's anthropomorphic language. That's human language that shows up in the ancient world to say we want to try to represent a person for a deity. And he takes on these characteristics. Hair on your head? I didn't know that you had those types of human qualities, God. So let's talk about the one on the throne. Maybe the most important part. And I saw something like the outward appearance of amber, something like the appearance of fire. So there's Ezekiel 1. Now we're back in Ezekiel. That fire connection. With a covering around it from the likeness of his loins and upward. So he's kind of seeing waist up. Okay. And from the likeness of his loins and downwards, I saw something like the appearance of fire, and it was radiant all around. So kind of below the lower body, fire. Okay. Like the appearance of a bow that is in the cloud on a rainy day. Now, what did John just say he saw? A rainbow. Well, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Such was the radiance around it. Thus was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of Yahweh. And I saw, and I fell on my face, and I heard a voice speaking. So Ezekiel has absorbed a lot of information, but as soon as he starts looking upon the one on the throne, what does he end up? On his face. He's looking at cherubim, he's looking at the throne, he's looking at and then when he gets to who's sitting in front of him, the Ancient of Days, God Almighty, and he sees this being, he can't contain him. He's just down. Boom. He's down. Now I want to show you something that's really interesting. Now we always talk about, okay, Ezekiel's getting the first time vision of this. Like this is all new stuff to him. Okay? But I want you to think about the Temple of Solomon. That's probably where Ezekiel grew up, right? Around it. I mean, he was getting ready to be a priest. There's a few verses I want you to see if you can make the connection between the Temple of Solomon and what we just read in John's writing in Revelation and in Ezekiel's. See if you can pick it up, okay? All of the temple he overlaid with gold until all of the temple was finished. So this is when Solomon's building the temple. David gave him the instructions, remember. All of the altar which belonged to the inner sanctuary, he overlaid it with gold. He made 2 cherubim of olive wood for the inner sanctuary, 10 cubits high, so it's about 15 feet high. Okay, 5 cubits was the first wing of the cherub, and 5 cubits of the second wing of the cherub, 10 cubits from the tip of its one wing to the tip of its other wing. The second cherub was 10 cubits according to the same measurement, and there was one shape for the 2 cherubim. The height of the first cherub was 10 cubits, and so was the second cherub. Now, what's he building?
He's building the temple, but it sounds like the ark.
It does sound like the ark. It also sounds like the throne we just read, right? You have these cherubim with their wings outstretched. So that's why I say when Ezekiel's seeing this, he's not going, I've never seen this before. There's imagery of this all over in the temple. Here's verse 27, 28. He placed the cherubim in the middle of the inner house, and they spread out the wings of the cherubim. The wing of the first cherubim touched against the wall, and the wing of the second cherub was touching against the second wall. Their wings spread to the middle of the house and were touching wing to wing. He also overlaid the cherubim with gold. Do you see what he's doing? He's got these cherubim with 2 outstretched wings. Isn't that what we just read about the chariot throne? Their tips are touching. Here's in 1 Chronicles 28. Then David gave to Solomon his son the plan of the vestibule and of its houses, its treasuries, its upper rooms, its inner chambers, and of the house of the lid of the ark, and the plan of all that he had in mind for the courtyards of the house of Yahweh and for all the surrounding storage rooms. So David says, I didn't get it built, but I'm going to have my son do it, right? Remember, he says, you're not going to do it. You shed too much blood. But your son, I'm going to have him build it. And so David had all the stuff. He had laid out all the materials. He had all the plans, and he said, okay, Solomon, I can't build it, you build it. Because it bothered him that God didn't have a place to dwell. He wanted him to have a house, right? Goes on to verse 18, and for the altar of incense made of refined gold, by weight in gold for the plan for the... Did you catch that? David gave him the plans to build the temple, and he specifically says, I gave him the plans and the gold for the chariot. What is he talking about? He's talking about the chariot throne. There's an example of that in Solomon's temple. And he even calls it a chariot. The word is Merkabah, okay, in Hebrew. The chariot. In fact, that ties into Ezekiel because in ancient Judaism there was a group of Jews that believed in this thing called Merkabah mysticism. And the idea was as a Jew in this particular, we'll call it a sect of Jews, they believed that one of the highest things you could attain was studying the scripture, the Torah, to such a degree that you would get to essentially leave your body and go into the throne room and see the chariot throne. And they called it Merkabah. So what are they saying? Our goal is to go to where God is, and that the word is chariot. They all understood this chariot imagery. Okay? The cherubim with outspread and covered wings over the ark of the covenant of Yahweh. All of this I give to you in writing from the hand of Yahweh. He instructed me about all the workings of this plan. So David says, I didn't just come up with this. Where did he get the plans? And what did God tell him? I want you to build me a temple, and here's the plans, and it looks like the throne chariot. It has the chariot piece in there. Now, we're not done yet, okay? He's building the temple, right? 1 Kings 7:1, Solomon built his house over 13 years, and he finished all of his house. Some interesting components to this. He also made the molten sea, so he hired these guys to come in and do the work. So Solomon hires a couple different guys to come in. They were craftsmen. And it says, he also made the molten sea 10 cubits in diameter, and 5 cubits was its height. A measuring line of 30 cubits would encircle it all around. The sea was standing on what? 12 oxen, with 3 facing to the north, 3 facing to the west, 3 facing to the south, 3 facing to the east. What does that connect to Ezekiel? You had a cherub that he sees with an ox face, and then there's these 4 corners, this 4 imagery of they could go wherever, the directional point pieces. We talked about that last week. The sea was on top of them. So what are they carrying, these oxen? This giant bowl that's basically could be filled with water, I guess you could say. It can hold 2,000 baths, okay? A lot of water in there. But it would have been just like a crystal surface on the top of that thing, right? With that water sitting in there. The sea was on top of them with all of their hindquarters turned to the inside. Its thickness was a handbreadth, but its rim was as the work on the brim of a cup. Like the bud of a lily, it held 2,000 baths. This is all the stuff that David's telling Solomon you need to build. And this all shows up in the chariot throne of Ezekiel. All of these things show up somewhere. This crystal and so on. He goes on to say, now, this was the construction of the stands. There were frames for them and frames between the crossbars, and on the frames which were between the crossbars were what? Lions, oxen, cherubim. Did we see that in Ezekiel? Yep. On the crossbars, both above and beneath the lions and the oxen, were workings of cascading wreaths. There were 4 bronze wheels. Oh, what do you know? We got wheels now. For each of the stands with bronze axles and 4 support pedestals, for these were under the basin, and the supports were decorated on each side with wreaths, so they could wheel them around, right? 4 of the wheels were underneath the frames, and the axles of the wheels were on the stands. The height of each wheel was 1.5 cubits. The construction of the wheel was like the construction of the wheel of the chariot. What chariot are you talking about? Their axles, their rims, their spokes, and their naves, which is the hubcap, were all cast. He engraved on the plates, on its supports, and on its frame cherubim, lions, and images of a palm tree, according to the space for each, with wreaths all around. This is quite an image in the temple. You also have palm trees. You have like tons of pomegranates. You have all this stuff. What is he trying to show? What's he trying to create? Garden of Eden imagery, with a throne, chariot, and cherubim in the very midst of it. Does that not sound like Eden? It's the place where you would meet God. That's what Adam did. That's what they understood, is that God would meet you in the garden, and this is what it looked like. And he's trying to recreate that. And so when Ezekiel is standing there and he gets this vision, what does he see? The mobile version of that. Here it comes.
So is there a reason why the eagle isn't in there?
I don't know why. We don't necessarily know the reason why they put it in there. The wings, I guess wings on certain things could maybe have inspired. I think the idea is the swiftness of it. If he's not going anywhere, maybe they didn't feel like the eagle was necessary since this is the temple set here. The throne moving might be more of an imagery for movement, with the eagle was the swiftness piece. Could be. A lot of similarities between the Temple of Solomon and Ezekiel's vision. If God appears to Ezekiel on a throne chariot, that means he's not bound to a temple in Jerusalem. Did you catch that? You think I'm over there. I'm actually with you guys over here. He goes to his people even when in bondage. This would have been huge to them. He's not bound to that place. I don't have to go there to see him. He came to us. The 4 suggests God can be anywhere he wants, anytime he wants. That's that 4 directional points, the 4s that show up everywhere. I'll go wherever I want, and I can be there that quick. He's not bound to a place in Jerusalem and far from his people. That's the imagery I would say that try to come away with. The awesome glory of God is not bound to a temple. Last thing. We talked about the Merkabah mysticism and how they kind of had this idea, meaning chariot. I kind of got that a little out of order, but I think is important to touch base on that. Same term Solomon used. So here's just some final thoughts, and I'm going to let you go. What Ezekiel saw was not foreign to the Jews or the Babylonians. So when somebody says it was a UFO and he didn't know what he was seeing, don't buy it. Too many connections. Too many, including in the temple. Everything seen by Ezekiel can be seen in the Temple of Solomon to some degree. Little differences, but pretty close in some places. John actually sees the same thing in Revelation 4 that Ezekiel is seeing in chapter 1 and chapter 10. Connection, yeah, big game of telephone maybe. So next week, we're going to look at the one seated on the throne a little bit closer, because that's important. What can we learn from his conversation with Ezekiel, because they're about to have a conversation, right? And we're going to look at Ezekiel's first acts as the prophet. It gets a little interesting on some of the stuff he does and he says, but that's where we're going to end this week. So did you learn something, I hope, this week? Hopefully the connections maybe to the Old Testament temple and such can make a little bit more sense. But I think the thing hopefully you came away with is, if you're a Jew and you were in exile in Babylon, you're thinking God has abandoned us. Ezekiel may have even been thinking that, just as he's getting ready to take the priesthood, and here he is by the river Kabar, and what shows up? The God of Israel, and he's not in his temple, he's on his chariot throne, coming to Ezekiel, because he's not done. I think that could have been scary, as much as, what are you doing here? I thought you were there, and here he is. So for me, I kind of took it importantly to think of, like, we kind of come to church and we think of it as, this is where I come and I meet God. He's here and in this building. This kind of debunks that. He's here and we can come and we can worship him together. But when we leave, he's mobile. He can go and he can be where you're at, whether you're here or not.